Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lacey, for the introduction and for the invitation to come speak with you all today. As you see on the screen here, my presentation is called From Patronage to Guaranteed Income, Why We Need Artistic Investment in Economies in the 21st Century. So artist patronage in Western societies has taken many forms and has served different cultural needs throughout time. And so today's talk, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about those different models of patronage that have existed, mostly because I have this really this itch and tendency to want to always connect the past to the present. And as a living and working artist, I am really grateful for this opportunity to draw these connections between historical models of patronage for artists and what we need in this current moment to support artists in our communities. So I hope to trace some of those historical models of patronage in effort to make the argument that we should be looking toward guaranteed income for artists and for others, but in particular for artists for robust and diverse artistic production in our communities, whether they're rural, urban, or between. So I want to first start by talking a little bit about myself and introducing myself. As Lacey mentioned, I'm a former tenured professor of women's and gender studies. I moved to Minnesota in 2004 to pursue my doctorate degree in feminist studies from the University of Minnesota. And I earned that degree in 2010. And moved to Moorhead, where I taught in women's and gender studies there for almost 10 years. I want to read an essay I wrote in 2018 when I was on sabbatical, and I took a class, an art class, for the first time in my adult life, and probably for the first time in my educational career. So when I left home at 18, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. When I left home at 18, I moved to Kansas to reconnect with my family that is from that area. And I went to the University of Kansas, double majored in women's studies and psychology, and minored in leadership, finished all of those degrees in 4 years. And so I didn't really have a lot of time to explore art. And as you'll hear in this essay, I am really an unlikely artist. And it's part of my story that I'd like to share with you to ground us today. So the quote on the, the quote on the screen here is from a text that I really like. If you haven't read it, it's called I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. It's a young adult novel. But I think it really sums up this relationship between art and family dynamics in a really, really beautiful way. So let me just read this to you. In second grade, Mama took me to the Albuquerque Public Schools testing site for my last chance to be deemed gifted. Excuse me. My brother Adam, 17 months younger than me, was estimated gifted by his teachers and proven by the testing site way back when he was in kindergarten. After my parents saw the enriching learning opportunities afforded my brother because of his gifted status, Mama fought for me to earn the right as well. As an 8-year-old in the second round of testing, feeling the pressure, I did the best I could. After working my way through conceptual puzzles like using small individual shapes to make a new larger form, working various math and word problems, and drawing pictures as responses to posed questions, Mama was called into the room as I was excused. She received the news that I wasn't gifted according to the tests. It was my last chance. Because the program ended admittance by the start of one's third grade year, I'd failed again. Mama was tasked with telling me that I didn't make the cut as we drove home. Did I really mess up the tests? I asked. No, honey, she said kindly. They said you did just fine. It's just, what is it? I spurted out quickly with worry heavy in my voice, tears crowding the back of my throat. Finally, she expelled. The woman giving the test said you're not creative enough to be gifted. Hands gripping the steering wheel, looking forward, she chose to let me sit with my feelings of disappointment of failure, of letting down my family, and the new knowledge that I'd just gained. I guess I'm smart, just not creative. Unlikely moments have a way of holding on to you like a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of your shoe. You're not creative enough was a juicy glob of bubble gum on the ball of my favorite pair of wedges. It picked up other fragments of substances along the way that morphed the blob into I'm not creative. Enough sounded like there was a possibility to improve. And as a perfectionist in a high achieving family who had now failed the test twice, I wanted to drop that caveat too. As a failure, I wanted to go all the way. And so I internalized that I was not creative for a very long time. Not being creative served me fine. I was able to achieve in other ways, following directions, superb. Reading comprehension and my ability to devour a book, phenomenal. Putting all my best efforts into a project until it's done, fantastic. But the drawbacks of not being creative crept into all areas of my life, even as I tried my best to keep my disappointment of creativity's absence at bay. It came up when the art teacher at our public school, when she was able to afford, rolled into our classroom every other month as we busily painted upside down under our desks as third graders pretending we were Michelangelo with a ceiling as a canvas. It scratched me gently each time I turned in an essay I tried my best to craft in a compelling way. It gripped me hard around my wrist when I thought about how to solve math problems differently than my dad, my rocket scientist father, tasked with going over my math with me when I struggled, him yelling at the end of our time together, me crying onto my notebook in our nightly ritual of mutually destructive frustration. Though I may have thought I was the opposite of creative for a good portion of my life, eventually, if you find the skills to process that which holds you back, you can learn to let the negativity go or live with your challenges with acceptance. In graduate school, I started attending creative nonfiction writing workshops to develop and hone my craft as a writer. While academic scholarship is not typically written in easy, accessible, or beautiful language, the field of Chicana studies upholds the second wave feminist slogan, the personal is political. And for me, this means finding ways to draw on our life experiences to politicize them as a force for positive social change. I began to ground storytelling methods into my written work as a way to bring creativity into my scholarship. At the same time, my friend Alex and I started a tradition of holding Chicana craft days as a way to encourage self-care, to de-stress when we felt the weight of dissertation deadlines looming. We painted objects for our home, sculpted clay into useful yet aesthetically pleasing and culturally relevant things, like roses hot glued onto metal thumbtacks to spruce up bulletin boards we framed in fabric. We were inspired by Chicana feminist theory, Chicana literature, and the method of rascachismo, the Mexican working class art form of using what you have access to and making something beautiful from it. Like how beautiful Dia de los Muertos altars would be made from items one already has at home. Upcycled trash, repurposed to honor loved ones long past, but still very present in our lives. Erica Sanchez's character, Julia Salgado, gets to our cravings of the desire to see ourselves in the cultural landscape and the value of elements of art that paint our realities in the space of our home galleries with color and bold demands. In addition to the deep well of inspiration I draw from Chicana feminist ways of being, I also honor and recognize that my life as a queer femme connects me to a queer creative culture where our very presence in spaces, our relationships, our refusal to conform to gender and sexual norms, challenges society to be more inclusive of difference. Our art manifests in how we dress, how we wear our hair, how we perform our gender identities. At the intersections of identities reviled by some, making art becomes one way to seek visibility, recognition, and representation. Our art is a political making where we envision new futures, change minds, imagine alternative realities, and use visual culture to fuel our radical decolonial social change revolutions. Art has always been an important part of my life, even as I once thought it was supposed to be kept at a distance, meant only for appreciation or scholarly analysis, only to be made by people who were anointed creative. Today, I see art as another tool in our toolbox to inspire different ways to be in the world, another format to express myself and the ideas I hold dear, a medium to explore ideas beyond words alone in hopes of making a change. I enrolled in this course because I have set a goal to deepen my artistic practice in 2018. I believe a foundation course can help build my vocabulary and deepen my understanding of why and how other artists approach their work in the ways that they do. I learn best in a community where I know my peers and expectations for our work is clearly communicated. I also learn best when I know where my professor is coming from, what inspires her, how she sees three-dimensional art as an important form of expression. I'm motivated by expectations of excellence with healthy reminders that sometimes our best is not perfection, but best efforts is our best. I hope to come away with new knowledge and appreciation of three-dimensional art with new language to describe how art takes my breath away. I want to be excited to look at sculpture instead of rushing past it at the museum. I wish to be enthralled by installations with a broader awareness of how folks make things work. I desire in the deepest part of my soul to continue to heal from the burden of negatively believing I was not a creative person for too many years of my life. Above all, I wish to feel confident in being not only a work of art, but an artist with something to say across dimensions beyond the plane filled only with words. Thank you. Thank you. So that was an essay I submitted to my art teacher after I had earned my PhD, and I went back to earn an Associate of Fine Arts degree at my local community college. I want to ask you if you felt something with that story. Did you feel anything of value from me sharing that story? Just hold that answer in your heart. If you were to put a dollar figure on it, how much is that story worth? In our capitalist structure, I think it's important for us to understand how do we value the arts? And in two ways, historically, we have thought about the economic value of the arts, and we've also thought about the cultural value. So I would argue that that story I shared definitely connects the cultural value of how we educate young children, how we think about creativity in our society. There's lots of things that we could draw from that story to talk about today. But what we don't really see in that story is what is the economic value of that kind of art? What are the associations with market transactions, in other words, that can help us understand how to value a story or a painting or a composition? The cultural values that we use to describe art can be understood as the ways that we reflect the meaning embodied in our expression, embodied in or expressed by artworks, artifacts, texts, performances, rituals, and customs. So I think we have a real tension in our society between how we value art because of these two competing factors. What's the cultural value and what's the economic value? So on the screen here is a cave painting that was made somewhere between 17,000 and 22,000 years ago. It's from the southeastern part of France in Lascaux. And I love this image, and the images of that cave are just so beautiful in so many ways. If you're ever interested, just Google the caves of Lascaux. But Obviously, this holds some cultural value to us. UNESCO World Heritage has cited this as a World Heritage site, but we can develop economic value from it in terms of tourism. We can create structures and systems where we can make money from people going to visit these caves. But we, as a society, over time and currently, really do need to understand how we value the arts in our society in both that cultural and economic way. Many would agree that art holds an intrinsic value. Obviously, humans have been making art since humans have existed. These cave paintings are an example of that. Pottery, textiles, all kinds of functional art. If we look at the ancient world, statues, decorative art, all sorts of those things help us understand the relationship between cultural value and market forces. But as an artist in the 21st century, we continue to face things like pricing challenges. How do you price a work of art? Who decides the value of a painting? I'm going to talk about paintings most as my example in the art forms because I am a painter, but you can just replace painter with any other work of art that you like, a poem, a composition, a sculpture, an installation, a quilt, right? What is the price that we put on these objects in our current society, and how do they actually enable artists to live a livelihood and continue to make their work? Another challenge between that example of economic versus cultural value is our cultural attitudes towards art. Is art something that's nice to have as a luxury, as something that's extra? Or is art something that is embedded in everything that we do? Whose role is it to cultivate arts activities, experiences? Whose role is it to fund those sorts of things? Is that the state's role? Is that the private citizen's role? These kinds of questions, when we think about the addition of like market forces and our current capitalist structure, really provide us with varying cultural attitudes about the importance of art and the ways that we should approach funding art in our society. In the United States, this has looked like very different than what it used to be in the past. So artistic production in state level societies is different from other types of economic activities. Artists' work is labor intensive and not easily subject to labor reduction through changes in the technique of production. The products of an artist's efforts are what economists call merit goods. Musical pieces, paintings, and books of poetry have limited demand. As a result, the producers of such work often cannot survive solely on the sale of these goods. Because of the labor intensity, low demand, and limited output, artistic activities usually require some form of economic patronage. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what is patronage and what does it look like in the past. So who was a patron and what has that term meant over time? So looking at some of the historical private patronage models, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term patron was widely used in ancient Rome to describe, quote, a man of status or distinction who gives protection and aid to another person in return for deference and certain services. So we're already seeing some challenges in this definition. You might be like, ooh, I don't know if I like that. As somebody who has a PhD in feminist studies, I definitely do not like that for a number of reasons. But in return for deference and certain services sounds really problematic to me for artistic creativity and expression. But that has been the historical model. So on the screen here, you are seeing an example of a manuscript. So in medieval Europe, patronage, growing out of this idea of how the Romans had thought about it, which was not limited to artists, but in medieval Europe began to be limited and focused more on artists. Patronage has a specific meaning within practices of the Christian church. So patronage in medieval Europe was the right of presenting a member of the clergy to a particular ecclesiastical benefice or living. So it was a way to support the church's activities. It was a way to spread your wealth to support the Christian church, but also to archive yourself in history. So this is an example of a medieval manuscript on the screen here, and this is a zoomed in version of the second page here. And it's really hard to make out what this image is, but the idea is we're seeing God or Jesus sitting on a throne, and the two figures next to the main central figure are actually the patrons who paid for this book. So they were painted into the manuscript. And often this was done really slyly, like they were talking to saints, or they were time traveling and talking to, the Virgin Mary. But this was one of the first ways that we see patronage come about in a historical framework. The other way that we can think about patronage in Western art history is with the ways that the private and public sphere really overlap. So when we think about private funding of the arts and patronage, we're thinking about individual, rich, wealthy people who have disposable income that can help support artists. But there are also public institutions like the church that become important patrons of artists. So of course, what you have in front of you is an image of the Sistine Chapel, covered in murals that the great Michelangelo painted over many years. And while he was funded somewhat by the Catholic Church, who was the #1 patron of artists for a long time in the development of altarpieces, saintly relics, architecture, etc., Michelangelo was also patronized by the Medici family. So if you don't know who the Medici are, they are a very influential Italian family, mostly known and given the honor of being the people that mostly fueled and funded the Italian Renaissance during the 15th century. When we see the height of the Italian Renaissance happening in Florence and then moving out from there. The Medici family gained their wealth from banking and spent billions of dollars funding this public-private art. So again, that public-private binary is not so clean here. But they would commission sculptures, they would commission tombs, they would help pay the artists to do the work, like Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel for the Vatican. And not only this, but they also spawned royalty by marriage, and they also had 4 popes elected from the Medici family. So these are deep-seated power players that not only were wealthy, but were very well connected in a political way. So this is the kind of model that eventually sweeps Europe and ultimately becomes something that the public governments of Europe decide is something that they want to invest in. So in the United States, unlike European countries and Canada, there has never been a national consensus about the appropriateness of public support for the arts, especially by the federal government. So we're going to jump a little bit forward and back in time here, but this public funded model is also known as the European model of patronage. And this example I'm pulling up here is an image of the Finnish symphony, the Finnish National Opera, And so you'll see a lot of European countries have national operas in addition to national museums. They have national programs that are purposefully investing in a state level way to support the creation and labor of artists and their works. I'm pulling Finland here because in a 2000 report from the National Endowment for the Arts, I'm sorry if you can't see this very well. This table goes over the per capita investment that nation states had made in 1993 through 1995. So I know this is super old data. I think probably still pretty relevant. In this 11-page report published by the NEA, we can see that the US has the lowest per capita investment in artists, which is $6 per person, contrasting to Finland and Germany, who pay per person $91 and $85 respectively for public arts spending. And of course, this is like kind of comparing apples to oranges because there are so many more people that live in the United States, such a larger geography, but $6 to $91 is a really giant gap and like a huge discrepancy. And we'll talk a little bit about like maybe the state would be a better way to, like the state of Minnesota, as would be a better way to maybe compare some of this data. But the point of this is the United States has never really had a public effort to fund the arts in the ways that Europe and Canada have. So in the 19th century, when we go back a little bit in time here to like the Gilded Age of the United States, we have the emergence of what is known as the collector patron. So without royalty, aristocrats, or an established church to bestow commissions, the young American Republic had to wait for the most ambitious amongst its increasing number of prosperous citizens to discover the value of public art patronage. So while professional training of artists was a civic concern, at least as early as the 1790s, the art collector as patron took longer to emerge in our nation. The first real art museum in the United States did not open until 1842, when Daniel Wadsworth, the art collector and patron of Frederick Edwin Church, established the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. So collector patrons were guided by this underlying philanthropic sense in the United States, which by those who study collector patrons' activities view as a peculiarly, can't say that today, particular American value. So guided by this idea that there's a belief that each citizen must assume personal responsibility for the welfare of the community. And this, again, are values that we're seeing emerge in a abundance, wealth, land grab, right? So in this early 2000 exhibition guide about collector patrons and their motivations, because the collector patron of the 18th and 19th century becomes a model for our current era. They say something like, modern collectors and patrons are noted to believe that philanthropy is the obligation of the wealthy in a democratic America, and that this attitude is unlike that of many countries in which governments are the primary funders of the arts. So we begin to see in our American history some of the ways that the ideology of whose responsibility is it to pay for the arts begins to unfold. If you think of any museum you've ever visited, it is likely has been started by an individual patron collector. So The Walker Art Center in Minneapolis began because Thomas Barlow Walker was a lumber baron in 1879 and amassed a large collection of contemporary works, established the Walker Art Gallery in 1927. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Works Project Administration Federal Art Project in just a second here. But during that era, it became the Walker Art Center. So if you've ever been to the Walker, you know who to thank for having this beautiful building and the bequeathing of these beautiful objects to look at. But this was the main model for a number of places. And even if you're not familiar, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. was the collection of Andrew Mellon, who gifted it during the Roosevelt presidency, and not only his collection of art that he had amassed, but also a building and an endowment to continue to support the creation and maintenance of the art and expansion of the collection. So while Andrew Mellon didn't want his name on the building, he was maybe a little bit more virtuous of the billionaires amongst us. Could be relative. I mean, he was friends of Carnegie, who stole our iron from the Iron Range, but I digress. So really think about like all of these institutions come from these collector patron models that are a little difficult to even imagine now. Like, can you imagine collecting work and starting your own institution? I shouldn't say it's impossible. Cheech Marin is a really good example of somebody who has contemporarily done that. The actor and Chicano activist has the largest private collection of Chicano and Chicana art that he's been amassing for decades. And he recently opened in collaboration with the city it's located in California, which the name is escaping me right now. But the Cheech now is a public collection that people can go visit in the same vein as this collector patron that I'm sharing here. But the only time that the US actually did have a time in our nation's history where there was this federal political support was during the Great Depression, when FDR put artists to work. So you see in the slide here that the Treasury Administrator, Edward Bruce, who's on the left in the really cool suit and hat, came back from a trip to Mexico and was so inspired by all of the public murals he saw there, painted by the great Mexican muralists, that he told FDR, you know what, we should really have murals. And so that was one of the ways that artists were employed specifically during the Great Depression and put back to work. 2,000 artists and art workers alone in New York City had work because of the Works Project Administration. But as we continue on to our current era, we really see our public and private partnerships of funding the art as this pluralistic patronage model. So we do have some federal funds that are available for artists to access on a grant-funded basis through things like the National Endowment for the Arts, which, if you haven't seen, are facing giant cuts. People's grants have been taken back. Changes to the ways that changes to the programming and the goals of the NEA under the current federal administration have really created a lot of challenges. The National Endowment for the Arts was created in 1966 and began federal appropriations then. And this continued on, increasing in the amount of money, but I don't know if I have the data to say that that's like grown in real time with inflation. I mean, we have increases of the money available, but not sure about the impact. And also around this time in 1967, David Rockefeller founded the Business Committee for the Arts, which has spun into Americans for the Arts, which is an advocacy group that really works to encourage large scale and smaller scale corporations to invest in artists. So like be the corporate sponsor for the city's symphony, for example. And of course, states have decided that they will take ownership of funding the arts. So in 2008, the state of Minnesota voters approved the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, which you all probably know very well. That is going to be coming up for another vote soon, and it would be something to keep in your back pocket to encourage your local legislators to continue to support, not just for the Clean Water Act element of it, but for the cultural programming that has been able to be facilitated through this state level funding for artists that have given artists in every county of Minnesota the opportunity to engage in arts programming and artistic activities, regardless of their geography. So I've talked a lot about these models, but I'd like to encourage us to think about like, well, what about the artists? This has been a lot about the patrons of the arts, the wealthy who can engage with the art that's made. There are real challenges with a lot of these historical models. One being artistic control that we talked a little bit about. There's this notion of artistic change and innovation, and the ability to have innovative, creative things happen might be difficult by state-funded arts opportunities. So think about like if you make a symphony that is critiquing the king, is that gonna be a symphony that people are able to come and hear? There are market forces that also kind of create challenges to what kinds of art can be sold and the tastes of people. What do they like to see on their walls? What do they like to hear? Those aesthetic decisions mean that for state-funded or otherwise funded artists, however that funding comes, might be taking fewer risks in their work. And then, of course, the power and hierarchy, like who has access to being patronized. In the examples I talked about, the Medici family, and even the idea of the patron as this patriarch that supports and cares for their artist, that did not include women. Women were rarely offered the opportunity to be these large-scale patrons themselves, and they certainly weren't able to access artistic opportunities in the same way. And if we look at the WPA program, it largely supported white artists, which needed work at that time, but also meant that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color artists were largely excluded from federal programs that could have been something very beneficial for their communities. So there's equity, power, challenges, and hierarchies that are at play for this individual model of patronizing artists. So this slide on the screen is my friend Claire, who makes these amazing paintings that she calls brodalesques, which is an art historical term, play on the odalesque. But she uses this hashtag, where's my Medici, all the time. So we joke a lot about like, where is our Medici? Like, who's gonna fund the opportunity for me to just make the art that I wanna make? So all of these broader philosophical and socially constructed considerations, what do we make of the value of the artist behind the art? So I'm actually gonna skip ahead a little bit here. A guaranteed income is a monthly cash payment given directly to individuals. It's unconditional with no strings attached and no work requirements. A guaranteed income is meant to supplement rather than replace the existing social safety net and can be a tool for racial and gender equity. So Springboard for the Arts launched a pilot in 2021 where they began to purposefully fund artists through guaranteed income. These cash payments that are monthly and unrestricted. And I had the opportunity to become one of these guaranteed income recipients by lottery and by geography. So they started the program in 2021, where they targeted artists that were living in the St. Paul, Frogtown, and Rondo neighborhoods, which have been historically disinvested in and particularly hit hard with policies like redlining and the driving of I-94 through their community. And they've continued to grow this program to ultimately support 50 artists in St. Paul and 50 artists in Otter Tail County. And so in March of 2023, I began receiving guaranteed income, and was originally expected to receive that for 18 months. And right at the end of my 18 months, we learned that they had received private foundation funding to continue the program to fund 100 artists for a total of 60 months. So I am in year 2 of 5 of being an artist who has been a recipient of guaranteed income. And shout out to Springboard for the Arts, who allows me to be here today, right? And I wanted to highlight this quote from Laura Zabel, who is the executive director of Springboard for the Arts. The focus on artists and creative workers is rooted in the idea that, like caregiving and community work, cultural work is a form of labor that communities depend on to be healthy, but is not adequately valued by our current economy. So when we think about the sorts of things that are not being valued in our economies, like care work and the social reproductive work of meaning making and social bonds that we need to be able to live in community and be good neighbors to each other, artists are essential in that project. And so I would advocate that guaranteed income is the patronage model that we need for our 21st century reality, because it takes away this idea of being deserving as an artist. Like, I don't have to be making the Leonardo masterpieces, although this is my work and I would say it's pretty masterful. Just, saying, if you want to become my patron, I will not deny it. Please talk to me afterwards. And I'll just end by saying a couple of words about this project that I was able to do. In addition to being a guaranteed income recipient, Springboard facilitated a cohort of 8 artists, both from St. Paul and Otter Tail County, to create work about guaranteed income. And I made this painting about my 3 goats that was turned into a billboard that I was able to talk about in an artist talk on the side of County Highway 210, and share about why I believe in rural, we tend to the herd connects to guaranteed income, because these goats that I live with, Edith, Willa, and Milagro, my herd, sit in this formation where they put their backs towards each other and look out in different directions and are constantly having each other's back. And to me, that's what rural community is. And I think guaranteed income is a natural reflection of that sort of spirit. In 2 of 5 years of guaranteed income for this artist has meant that I have not needed to fret about the fluctuation of egg or gas prices, which, as rural residents, gas prices fluctuations is really impactful, because we have to drive so much further for anything that we need. Excuse me. And I actually have my own chickens, although they're old hens and not laying. So the egg problem wasn't as bad for me, but I was also able to create a loan fund for other artists. Excuse me. And spread my guaranteed income to others who weren't receiving guaranteed income. And that has been one of the most impactful things that I've been able to do. I'm currently a patron of artists on Patreon, which is a crowdfunding source of support for about 6 different artists, and I kind of spread that love around. And I had a friend who was defrauded, and I was able to loan him money to help him and his family with 3 children and his wife live, because I had some extra money to be able to share with him. I've been able to take business risks and fail, and not have that failure mean that I can't continue to be an artist. And I've been able to lean more into the cultural value of my work, because guaranteed income is subsidizing the labor aspect of my art practice. And every hour of an artist's day could be something that translates into the need to be paid for wage labor purposes, because what I'm doing here today will likely end up in a painting in some other future moment. And so how do you say like, oh yeah, I deserve $30 an hour for this experience for a painting I'm going to make 6 years from now, right? So guaranteed income becomes a subsidizing practice for artists. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Actually, just a couple more things. If you're interested in getting involved in the work for guaranteed income in our state of Minnesota, not just targeted for artists, but for everyone, we've been trying to, I shouldn't say we, there have been some people that have been trying to advocate for guaranteed income in the state. Unlike some states, like our neighbors in Iowa that have outlawed the guaranteed income in their legislature, we in Minnesota believe that guaranteed income should be a tool in our toolbox to help people in whatever ways they need that economic support. So the Minnesota Financial Opportunity Coalition would be a place that I would highly recommend that you get connected to on that effort. And they're mnfinancialopportunity.com. And the nationalincomemovement.org is another way that you can learn more about these guaranteed income pilots that are happening. But shout out to Minnesota for investing in artists and creating the pathways for us to begin to continue to have these conversations about why guaranteed income is the patronage model for artists. So here is my information if you'd like to stay connected. I maintain a newsletter, so if you go to my website, you can sign up for that. I write and share opportunities for you to collect my work and also see my work up in Minnesota and beyond. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here. And
let's take a moment for a couple questions. I know it's 1 o'clock, so do what you got to do, but I think we can hang out for a couple minutes.
Thank you for the presentation. Just not a question, but an observation. A few years ago, during an intense battle over whether the minimum wage should be raised in Minnesota, I heard an economist, I think on public radio, make a terrific argument that the guaranteed minimum income for everyone was a far better approach economically than raising the minimum wage, because the guaranteed minimum income allows a small coffee shop or a sewing shop or whatever to hire people and to start a business without having the burden of a very high hourly wage. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Something to chew on. Yes, Karen.
Between my salary and employment, I had a period of time when I started my own business. And I was responsible for PR, marketing, program development, evaluation, and so forth. And I found that my creative abilities really went in the back seat. In fact, they went in the trunk. And I started being so thankful for the kings and princes and so forth who supported the Rembrandts and the Mozarts and the Da Vinci's and the Bachs and so forth, or we never would have had all that wonderful cultural, artistic creations. And so this looks like a permutation of some of that kind of support. And I think we do have to look at that because our energies cannot go in every direction at the same time. Thank you for your presentation.
It's a great point.
Well, Kandace, we've so appreciated learning from you. Thank you for coming up all this way. And we look forward to following your art and your career.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'll stick around for individual conversation, and I have cards as well if anybody